If you enjoy deep dives into the hidden histories of the Cold War and the silent battles fought in the shadows, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. These stories rely on viewers like you to keep the archives open. On a freezing Tuesday morning in February 1983, a gray Volga sedan moved slowly through the slush of the Leningradsky Prospect. Inside sat a man known to his neighbors as Viktor Andreevich Korin, but whose birth certificate, filed away in a dusty basement in Ohio, read Thomas Edward Shaw. He was 49 years old, balding, with the pale complexion of a man who spent his life under the hum of fluorescent lights. To the citizens of Moscow, he was a curiosity, a defecting American who had seen the light of socialism and crossed the Iron Curtain a decade prior. To the KGB, he was a trophy, a useful idiot employed in the first chief directorate as a translator of technical English. But to a tiny, compartmentalized office on the 7th floor of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, he was something else entirely. He was Asset 9 Ruby. He was the impossible thing. He was an American mole inside the KGB's headquarters at Yasenevo. The psychological weight of Thomas Shaw's existence was crushing. For 11 years he had lived a lie so complete that he sometimes struggled to remember which version of himself was real. The Soviet Union in 1983 was a place of deep paranoia. Yuri Andropov had just taken power, and the Kremlin was convinced that the United States was preparing for a nuclear first strike. The atmosphere inside the Yasenevo complex, the sprawling modern headquarters of Soviet foreign intelligence located in the forests just outside the Moscow Ring Road, was electric with fear. Shaw's daily routine was designed to be aggressively boring. He arrived at the checkpoint at 8:15 a.m. sharp. He showed his pass, ID number 4490Z. He walked the long, polished corridors to the Department of North American Affairs. He sat at a metal desk piled high with intercepted microwave transmissions, technical manuals from Boeing and Lockheed, and transcripts of congressional hearings. His job was to find nuance, to tell his Soviet masters not just what the Americans were saying, but what they meant. He was the perfect filter, and that was his weapon. By subtly altering the tone of a translation, by de-emphasizing a threat or exaggerating a weakness, Shaw could manipulate the flow of information reaching the Politburo. But his primary mission was surveillance. He was a camera lens aimed at the heart of the enemy, recording the names of KGB officers, the structure of their operations, and the rumors whispering through the cafeteria. On this particular morning, however, the routine broke. As Shaw settled into his chair and reached for his first cigarette of the day, a harsh, unfiltered Prima, a file landed on his desk. It wasn't the usual technical manual. It was a thin folder with a red stripe running diagonally across the cover, marking it as Eyes Only. His superior, a thick-set colonel named Arkady Volkov, stood over him. Translation, Victor. Priority 1. The director needs this by noon. Shaw opened the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten letter. The handwriting was jagged, nervous, but the language was English, and the header indicated it had been written in Washington, D.C. Shaw felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit his bloodstream. He recognized the jargon immediately. It wasn't just a letter, it was an offer. An American intelligence officer was offering to sell the identity of a mole in Moscow. Shaw stared at the paper, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't just translating a document, he was looking at his own death warrant. To understand how Thomas Shaw ended up in the inner sanctum of the KGB, one has to understand the year 1972. It was a year of disillusionment. The Vietnam War was raging, Watergate was brewing, and the fabric of American society seemed to be tearing apart. Shaw had been a mid-level analyst for the National Security Agency, a quiet man with a background in linguistics and a spotless record. The CIA plan, hatched in late 1970, was audacious in its madness. It was called Operation Long Game. The objective was to plant a source behind the Iron Curtain, not by recruiting a Soviet, but by sending an American. They needed someone who could withstand decades of scrutiny. They needed a true believer, or rather, someone who could pretend to be one. Shaw spent 18 months building his legend. He began attending anti-war rallies. He wrote angry letters to the editor of the Washington Post. He allowed his performance at the NSA to slip, filing reports filled with complaints about American imperialism. When he was inevitably fired in early 1972, he didn't go quietly. He made a scene. He flew to Mexico City, walked into the Soviet embassy, and threw his passport on the desk of the cultural attaché. The Soviets were skeptical. They interrogated him for 6 months in a safe house outside Havana before flying him to Moscow. They probed his mind, his history, his childhood. They used drugs, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress tests. Shaw never broke. He held to the narrative constructed by CIA psychologists. He was a man betrayed by his country, a man who wanted to help the Soviet Union build a better world. By 1974, the KGB was convinced. They didn't trust him completely. They never trusted anyone completely, but they saw his value. He knew the NSA's filing systems. He knew the slang of the American defense industry. They gave him a small apartment on Kutuzovsky Prospect, a stipend and a job. They gave him the name Viktor Andreevich Korin, but the transition was brutal. Moscow in the 1970s was gray and silent compared to the sensory overload of America. Shaw had to learn to live without the things he took for granted. Fresh coffee, reliable heating, the freedom to speak without looking over his shoulder. He was cut off from everyone he ever knew. His parents in Ohio went to their graves believing their son was a traitor. His ex-wife remarried, erasing him from her life. He was entirely alone. The only lifeline he had was a series of shortwave radio bursts. He kept a standard Soviet-issue VEF-202 radio in his kitchen. To anyone listening, he was tuning into classical music stations from Finland. But at specific times, on specific frequencies, a burst of static would transmit a sequence of numbers. It was a one-way street. He could receive instructions, but he couldn't reply. Not yet. For the first 5 years, he did nothing. He was a sleeper in the truest sense. He went to work. He translated documents. He drank vodka with his colleagues. He complained about the weather. He became part of the furniture. He waited for the KGB to lower its guard. And slowly, they did. They stopped following him to the grocery store. They stopped tapping his phone 24 hours a day. They began to see him not as the American defector, but just as Victor, the quiet guy in the translation department who always had a spare lighter. That was when the real work began. The Yasenevo complex was designed to intimidate. It was a fortress of glass and concrete hidden behind a perimeter of birch trees and electric fences. Inside, the air was always recycled, and the silence was heavy. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of thousands of people keeping secrets. By 1983, Shaw's access had expanded. He wasn't just translating manuals anymore. He was handling human intelligence. Reports from Soviet spies operating in New York, London, and Washington crossed his desk for linguistic analysis. He saw the raw feed of the Cold War. The document Shaw held in his hands in Chapter 1 was part of a new initiative. The KGB called it Operation Ryan, Raketno-Yadernoi Napadeni, or nuclear missile attack. It was the largest peacetime intelligence operation in Soviet history. The premise was terrifyingly simple. The KGB leadership believed that the United States was planning a surprise nuclear strike, and they tasked every agent worldwide to look for the signs. The paranoia was systemic. If a bank in London stayed open an hour late, the KGB analyzed it as a potential sign of war preparation. If the lights stayed on at the Pentagon, it was a sign. Shaw's job was to translate these frantic reports. The document on his desk was different. It was a letter from a walk-in, someone who had approached the Soviets voluntarily. The text was brief. To the resident, I am an officer with access to the Russia House files. I know you have a mole in Yasenevo, a man who is not who he says he is. I can give you his name for $50,000. Shaw translated the text mechanically, his hand steady even as his mind raced. Russia House was CIA slang for the Soviet division. The letter was genuine. Someone in Washington knew about him. Or they knew about someone like him. He had to neutralize this. If Colonel Volkov believed this letter, he would tear the department apart. Shaw typed his translation on the heavy, loud typewriter used for classified work. He added a translator's note at the bottom. Analysis. The syntax suggests a non-native English speaker attempting to sound American. The idiom Russia House is outdated and rarely used by current personnel. likely a provocation or a fabrication by a third-party intelligence service to sow discord. It was a gamble, a massive one. He was using his authority as the expert on Americans to discredit the source. He handed the file back to Volkov an hour later. Volkov read the note, chewing on the end of his mustache. He was a veteran of the Stalin years, a man who saw conspiracies in his soup. "You think it is a fake, Victor? I think it reads like a bad spy novel, Comrade Colonel," Shaw said, keeping his voice bored. "No active officer calls it Russia House anymore. They call it the Shop or SE Division. This feels like the British trying to make us chase our tails." Volkov grunted. "Perhaps, but we will open a file anyway, just in case." The file was opened. The threat remained. Shaw walked back to his desk, knowing he had bought time but not safety. He needed to warn Langley. He needed to tell them they had a leak. But communicating out of Moscow in 1983 was a logistical nightmare. The tradecraft of the Cold War was analog, tactile, and slow. There were no encrypted emails, no satellite phones for deep cover agents. There was only the physical transfer of material. Shaw had not sent a message in 6 months. The risk was simply too high. But the letter changed everything. The CIA station in Moscow operated under Moscow rules. These were unwritten laws of survival. Assume you are watched, never look back. Don't carry what you can't eat. Shaw had a signal arrangement with his handlers, who were officially diplomats at the U.S. Embassy on Tchaikovsky Street. The signal site was a lamppost on Kutuzovsky Prospect, 3 blocks from his apartment. If Shaw placed a small mark of orange chalk on the base of the post before 7 a.m., it meant he had a package to drop that evening. Shaw made the mark on his way to the bus stop. It was a split-second motion, looking like he was tying his shoe. He didn't look to see if it was seen. He just kept walking. The drop site for that night was codenamed Cornflower. It was a loose brick in the wall of a pedestrian tunnel near the Gorky Park metro station. The location was chosen for its crowds. Thousands of people passed through the tunnel during rush hour. The sheer volume of humanity provided cover. Shaw spent the day at work in a fugue state. He memorized the contents of the walk-in letter. He couldn't take a photo. The cameras at Yasenevo were too tightly controlled. He had to rely on his memory. He wrote the message on a strip of flash paper, cellulose nitrate that would flare up and vanish instantly if touched by a flame. He rolled the paper into a cylinder no wider than a cigarette and slid it inside a hollowed-out AA battery. At 6 p.m., he left the office. He took the metro. This was the dry cleaning phase. He rode the Circle Line, changed trains twice, backtracked, and waited until the doors were closing before jumping out at the last second. He watched reflections in the train windows. He looked for the same face appearing twice. He saw no one. But that didn't mean they weren't there. The KGB's 7th Directorate, the surveillance teams, were ghosts. He arrived at Gorky Park at 7:15 p.m. The tunnel was packed with workers heading home. The air smelled of wet wool and exhaust fumes. Shaw walked with the flow of the crowd, the battery palmed in his right hand, hidden inside a glove. He approached the section of the wall. He feigned a stumble, bracing himself against the bricks as the crowd surged around him. In that moment of contact, his hand found the loose brick. He slid the battery into the gap and pulled his hand away empty. It took 3 seconds. He didn't stop. He didn't check. He kept walking, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He exited the tunnel and bought a newspaper at a kiosk, forcing himself to read the headlines about harvest quotas. He had done his part. Now, a CIA case officer, likely wearing a wig and a change of clothes, would have to retrieve it within the hour. If the drop was blown, if the KGB was watching the tunnel, Shaw would be arrested before he reached his apartment. He walked home waiting for the black cars to pull up to the curb. They didn't. Spying is a lonely profession, and loneliness is a security risk. The KGB knew this. They watched their own officers for signs of depression or isolation. To maintain his cover, to seem like a contented defector, Shaw needed a life. He found one with Elena. Elena Morozova was a librarian at the Lenin Library. She was 42, divorced, with a sharp wit and a skepticism about the Soviet system that she only revealed after 3 bottles of wine. They had met at a symphony concert in 1981. She knew him as Victor, the translator. She knew he was an American, but she found it exotic rather than suspicious. For Shaw, Elena was a trap he had walked into willingly. He loved her, and that was the most dangerous thing he could have done. That night, after the dead drop, Shaw went to Elena's apartment. It was a small, cozy space filled with books and the smell of borscht. She sensed his tension immediately. "You're grinding your teeth again, Victor," she said, handing him a cup of tea. "Was Volkov yelling today?" "Just deadlines," Shaw lied. "Paperwork. It never ends." She sat beside him on the sofa, resting her head on his shoulder. "You should retire. We could get a dacha, grow potatoes, forget about the Americans and their missiles." Shaw froze. The irony was painful. "Maybe someday," he said. He looked at her and wondered what would happen to her if he were caught. The KGB did not believe in innocence by association. If Shaw was exposed as a mole, Elena would be interrogated. She would lose her job, her apartment, perhaps her freedom. She would be broken simply to see if she knew anything. He had never told her the truth, not a whisper. But his guilt was a physical weight. He was using her. She was his camouflage, his proof of loyalty to the state. A happy man with a Russian girlfriend isn't trying to destroy the system. "I was thinking," Elena said softly. "My sister in Kiev invited us for the May holidays. You need permission to travel, yes?" "Yes," Shaw said. "I'll ask Volkov." "Good. It will be nice. No radios, no translations. Just family. Family." The word echoed in his head. He was a man who had destroyed his own family to serve a country that couldn't acknowledge him. And now he was endangering the only person who cared about him. Later that night, as Elena slept, Shaw sat by the window, watching the snow fall on the empty street. He smoked a cigarette, the red cherry reflecting in the glass. He realized then that he couldn't leave Moscow. Not just because of the mission, but because of her. If the CIA ever extracted him, he would have to leave her behind. There was no protocol for bringing the girlfriends of deep cover moles. He was trapped, and the walls were getting closer. 2 weeks after the dead drop, the atmosphere at Yasenevo shifted from tense to suffocating. The second chief directorate, Internal Counterintelligence, had arrived. These were the wolf hunters. They didn't care about America. They cared about betrayal. They took over a suite of offices on the 3rd floor. Officers were called in for routine security updates that turned into 4-hour interrogations. Shaw watched as colleagues he had known for years were dragged out, weeping or shouting. Desks were searched. Safes were drilled open. The rumor mill was dead. Everyone was too terrified to speak. Colonel Volkov called Shaw into his office. There was a man sitting in the corner, a man in a badly fitting blue suit with eyes like calm water. "Victor," Volkov said, his voice tight. "This is Major Krovich from the 2nd Directorate. He has some questions about the translation logs." Shaw sat down. He kept his hands on his knees to stop them from trembling. "Of course. How can I help?" Krovich didn't blink. "You handled the translation of the walk-in document 2 weeks ago. The letter from Washington." "Yes," Shaw said. "You dismissed it as a fabrication. I offered my analysis based on the linguistic markers." Shaw corrected. "Yes, linguistic markers." Krovich opened a file. "We have received a follow-up report from our residency in Washington. They claim that there is indeed a rumor of a high-level source in Moscow. The Americans are calling him Ruby." Shaw felt the blood drain from his face. Ruby, that was his cryptonym, Asset 9. Ruby. How did they know the name? "Ruby," Shaw repeated, forcing a confused frown. "It's a gemstone, or a woman's name." "Or a code," Krovich said. "Tell me, Victor, if you were an American spy in this building, how would you get information out?" It was a trap question. If he answered too technically, he showed he knew tradecraft. If he played dumb, he looked incompetent. "I suppose I would try to memorize it," Shaw said carefully. "Taking paper out is impossible. The guards check everything. Memory is fallible," Krovich said. "Spies use tools, cameras, microdots, dead drops." He leaned forward. "Where were you on the evening of February 14th? "February 14th, the night of the dead drop. I was at home," Shaw said, "with my girlfriend Elena." "We checked the logs," Krovich said. "You left the building at 6. You arrived at her apartment at 8:30. That is a 2-hour gap. The metro ride takes 40 minutes. I walked, Shaw said. I needed air. The metro gives me headaches. You walked for 2 hours in the snow? It clears my head. Is that a crime, Major? Krovich smiled, a thin, joyless expression. Not yet. But we are watching, Viktor Andreevich. We are watching everyone. Shaw left the office with sweat soaking his shirt. They didn't have proof. If they had proof, he would be in a cell in Lefortovo prison, not walking out the door. But they were circling. The Ruby leak meant there was a mole in the CIA. A Soviet mole in Langley was hunting the American mole in Moscow. It was a mirror war. The CIA had received Shaw's warning. The message in the battery had reached Langley. They knew they had a leak. But finding a mole in the CIA is like finding a needle in a stack of needles. In Moscow, the pressure on Shaw escalated. Major Krovich wasn't done. He began a classic counterintelligence maneuver known as a barium meal. In medicine, barium is a radioactive dye you swallow so doctors can see the blockage in your gut. In espionage, a barium meal is fake information given to a specific suspect to see where it ends up. Volkov handed Shaw a document on a Monday morning. Top secret, Volkov whispered. Technical specifications for the new Akula-class submarine. We are deploying a new silent propulsion drive. The director wants this translated for the archives immediately. Shaw took the document. It looked real. The technical details were dense. If the U.S. Navy knew about a new silent drive, they would scramble their fleets. It was high-value intel. But Shaw hesitated. He noticed a slight inconsistency in the serial numbers referenced in the text. He cross-referenced it mentally with a file he had seen 6 months ago. The dates didn't match. This was the test. If Shaw passed this information to the CIA and the U.S. Navy reacted, the KGB would know the leak came from Shaw. He was the only one who had seen this specific version of the document. He sat at his typewriter. He had a choice. If he didn't pass it on, he protected his cover, but he might be withholding vital intel if he was wrong and the drive was real. If he did pass it on, he might be signing his death warrant. He decided to play the game. He translated the document perfectly, but he did not signal for a dead drop. He let the information sit. 2 weeks later, Volkov called him in. He looked relieved. Good work on the translation, Victor. Thank you, Comrade Colonel. It was a test, Volkov admitted, pouring 2 glasses of cognac. Krovich insisted. The document was fake. The propulsion drive doesn't exist. We wanted to see if the Americans would start dropping sonobuoys in the Barents Sea. Shaw kept his face impassive, though his insides were churning. And did they? No, Volkov said. They were quiet. You passed, Victor. Krovich is looking elsewhere. He thinks the leak is in the coding department. Shaw raised his glass. To loyalty, he said. To loyalty, Volkov replied. Shaw had survived the test, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they came back. And next time, the test would be harder. November 1983 arrived, bringing with it the most dangerous moment of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. NATO was preparing for a massive military exercise called Able Archer 83. It was a war game designed to simulate a nuclear conflict. To the West, it was just a drill. To the paranoid minds in the Kremlin, terrified by Reagan's Star Wars speech and the recent downing of Cal 07, Able Archer looked exactly like the cover for a real attack. The atmosphere at Yasnevo disintegrated into controlled panic. Leaves were canceled. Officers slept on cots in their offices. Maps of Europe were covered in red markers. Shaw was placed on a 24-hour watch. His job was to monitor the flash cables coming from the Soviet embassy in Washington. On the night of November 7th, the situation went critical. The KGB leadership received intelligence that NATO forces were moving to DEFCON 1 in the simulation. But the Soviet leadership, blinded by their own fear, believed the DEFCON change was real. Orders were being drafted to ready the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The silos in Ukraine and Siberia were being alerted. The world was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the West didn't even know it. Shaw sat at his desk, reading the hysteria in the reports. He realized with horror that there was no one to tell the Politburo that they were wrong. The echo chamber was complete. He had to act. This wasn't about protecting his cover anymore. This was about preventing the end of civilization. He needed to send a flash override message to Langley. He needed to tell them, they aren't bluffing. They are terrified. You need to scale down the exercise immediately, but the dead drop was too slow. A signal chalk mark would take 24 hours. He needed a direct line. He remembered a desperate contingency plan he had been given years ago. It was for imminent hostilities only. It involved a phone number in Moscow, a civilian line. Shaw waited until the shift change at 2 a.m. The corridors were bustling with exhausted officers. He slipped into the bathroom. He checked the stalls. Empty. He went to the window. He couldn't use the office phones. They were all recorded. He had to leave the building. But leaving during a crisis alert was forbidden. He went back to his desk and feigned a coughing fit. He hacked until his face was red. "Volkov," he gasped. "I need my medicine. It's in the car. My inhaler." Volkov looked up from a map of West Germany. He was gray with fatigue. "Make it quick, Victor. 5 minutes." Shaw ran. He ran to the parking lot. He didn't go to his car. He ran to the perimeter fence where the drivers smoked. There was a payphone there for the chauffeurs. He dialed the number. It rang 3 times. A voice answered. "Pizza delivery?" "The oven is overheating," Shaw said, his voice trembling. "Turn off the gas." "Repeat. Turn off the gas. The house is about to burn down." He hung up. He leaned against the cold metal of the phone booth, gasping for air. He had just broken every rule of tradecraft. He had used an open line. He had used a code phrase that might not even be active anymore. He walked back inside, waiting for the bullet. The message was received. The pizza delivery line was a direct patch to the CIA station chief's home. The code, "Oven is overheating," meant, "Soviet nuclear launch preparation is genuine. De-escalate immediately." The station chief in Moscow flashed the message to Washington. The national security advisor woke President Reagan. The gravity of the situation sank in. The U.S. government, which had thought the Soviets were just posturing, realized they had terrified a superpower into a corner. Orders were issued. The Able Archer exercise was abruptly toned down. B-52 bombers were grounded. Radio silence was lifted. The aggressive posture that the Soviets were tracking suddenly vanished. In the situation room at Yasenevo, the tension broke like a fever. The red markers on the maps stopped moving. The signs of attack evaporated. Volkov sat back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "They backed down," he muttered. The Americans backed down. Shaw stood in the corner, invisible again. He watched the world step back from the brink. He had done it. He had saved the world. And he knew with absolute certainty that the KGB would analyze the timing. They would see that the American de-escalation happened exactly 40 minutes after a phone call was made from the Yasenevo parking lot. They would check the logs. They would see who went outside. Viktor Andreevich Korin was a dead man walking. 3 days after the end of Able Archer, Shaw received the signal. He was walking past the lamppost on Kutuzovsky Prospect. There was a mark in blue chalk. Blue meant danger. Exfiltrate immediately. The CIA knew he was burned. The Ruby leak in Washington had likely confirmed that the warning came from inside Yasenevo. They were pulling the plug. The exfiltration plan was known as the Black Route. It didn't involve airplanes or diplomatic trunks. It involved a 2,000-mile journey to the Finnish border. Shaw had to leave now. He couldn't go home. He couldn't pack a bag. He had the clothes on his back, a fake internal passport sewn into the lining of his coat, and a wad of rubles. But there was Elena. He couldn't leave without saying goodbye. It was suicide, but he couldn't help himself. He used a public phone to call her work. "Elena," he said, "I have to go away for a while. Official business." "Victor?" Her voice sounded strange, strained. "Where are you?" "I can't say. I wanted you to know that I love you." There was a pause, a long, static-filled silence. "Victor," she whispered, "there are men here, in the library. They are asking about you." Shaw slammed the phone down. They were already onto him. They were tearing his life apart to find him. He ran to the metro. He had to get to the rendezvous point, a truck stop on the M10 highway north of Moscow. A CIA asset, a truck driver hauling timber, would be waiting. The city felt like a cage. Every police officer looked like an enemy. Every siren made him flinch. He made it to the outskirts of the city by dusk. He found the truck stop. It was a miserable place of mud and diesel. He saw the truck, a blue Kamaz with a white tarp. The license plate matched. Shaw walked toward it. He was 10 feet away when the floodlights turned on. They didn't kill him, not immediately. The ambush at the truck stop was executed with military precision. Alpha Group commandos. He was on the ground, handcuffed and hoodwinked before he could even raise his hands. He was taken to Lefortovo prison. He was stripped, searched, and thrown into a cell with the lights on 24 hours a day. The interrogation was conducted by General Remazov, the head of the 2nd Chief Directorate. He was a man who appreciated the irony of the situation. "Thomas Edward Shaw," Remazov said, sitting on a wooden chair in the cell. "Or should I call you Victor? We are so confused." Shaw said nothing. "You fooled us for a long time," Remazov admitted. "The defector who hated America. It was a good story. We wanted to believe it. That is our weakness. We are romantics at heart." He placed a photo on the table. It was Elena. She looked terrified. "She knows nothing," Shaw said, his voice a croak. "She is innocent." "Innocence is a matter of perspective," Remazov said. "She slept with a spy. She cooked for a spy. She is contaminated." "Let her go," Shaw begged. "I'll tell you everything. Just let her go." "You will tell us everything anyway," Remazov said calmly. "We have time. And the Americans? They have already forgotten you. They will deny you ever existed. You are a ghost, Mr. Shaw." For 6 months, Shaw lived in hell. He was broken down, piece by piece. He confessed to the dead drops, the translations, the warning call. He held back nothing, hoping that his cooperation would buy leniency for Elena. He never saw her again. In the spring of 1984, the interrogation ended. He was of no more use. He was a husk of a man. He waited for the execution. He expected the walk down the hallway, the bullet to the back of the head, the standard procedure. But the KGB had a different punishment for the man who had infiltrated their sanctuary. They didn't execute Thomas Shaw. Execution would have been a public admission that he had breached their security. It would have been embarrassing. Instead, they erased him. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility in Kazan, a prison disguised as a hospital. The diagnosis on his chart was sluggish schizophrenia, a political disease invented by the Soviets to explain why anyone would oppose the state. He was drugged into oblivion. His name was removed from the registry. Viktor Andreevich Korin ceased to exist. Thomas Shaw was already legally dead in America. He spent the next 7 years in a chemical fog, shuffling through corridors with other forgotten men. He lost his teeth. He lost his memories. He forgot the English language. He forgot the sound of Elena's voice. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The doors of the psychiatric prisons were thrown open. Confusion reigned. Files were burned. An old man walked out of the Kazan facility in the winter of 1992. He had no identification. He had no money. He wore a threadbare coat that didn't fit. He made his way to Moscow, hitchhiking on trucks. He went to Kutuzovsky Prospect. He found the apartment building where he had lived. A strange family was living in Unit 4B. They slammed the door in his face. He went to the library where Elena had worked. The staff had changed. No one remembered a librarian named Morozova. He found an old directory. It listed her address. He went there. The neighbors told him she had been arrested in 1983. She had been sent to a labor camp near Perm. She had died of pneumonia in 1986. The old man sat on the stairs and wept. He eventually found his way to the U.S. Embassy. He stood at the gate, looking at the Marines behind the bulletproof glass. He looked like a vagrant, a crazy Russian derelict. "I am an American," he told the guard in broken, accented English. "My name is Thomas Shaw. I am Asset Ruby." The guard looked at him with pity. "Sir, please step back." "Check the files," Shaw pleaded. "Operation Long Game, 1972. A young consular officer came out. He listened to Shaw's story. He made a phone call to Washington. The reply came back an hour later. The CIA archives showed no record of an agent named Shaw. The operation was too deep, too sensitive. Admitting it would mean admitting they had nearly started and then stopped World War III. It was a black hole in history. "I'm sorry," the officer said. "We can't help you. There is no record of you." Shaw stood on the sidewalk as the snow began to fall. He realized then the perfection of the plan. He had been designed to disappear. He was the ultimate mole, so deep that he had buried himself. He turned away from the embassy. He walked into the Moscow night, a man with no country, no name, and no future. He was never seen again. This story serves as a reminder of the human cost of the Cold War's silent battles. If you found this story compelling, please leave a like and share it with others. The history books often forget the ghosts, but we try to remember them.